Video games are indisputably an art form. They can be made by a massive number of people, all collaborating to create one giant project, or by one person with a ton of skills and a lot of time. The thing that they all share is that developers are trying to create a sense of immersion, a world that a player can jump into and be completely engrossed in, so much so that you can forget that what you're looking at is just a bunch of pixels. And sometimes the illusions can go a lot deeper than that. The goal of this video is to show some of the interesting illusory tactics that go into creating a game so that you as the player see and experience what the developers want you to. This video isn't meant to be a tutorial in any way, but it is knowledge that you might find interesting or could help you, especially if you aspire to get into any branch of game development in the future. So if you have any experience in game development, you may know about many of these already, but I want to start with making sure everyone knows a few basic concepts before I get into the thick of the video. A mesh is a 3D object before anything's added to it. Something like this or this. Just a plain digital 3D sculpture. A texture is some sort of picture or color that can be added to a mesh to add detail. Nearly every object you see in a game has a texture on it, even if that's just a plain color. If you're here and you know what light maps are, I'm leaving them out for now in order to avoid confusion. I want to start off with some tricks involving lighting. Lighting, in my opinion, is by far the one thing that can take graphics from looking terrible or outdated to looking photorealistic. Up until the last generation or two of gaming hardware, real-time lighting, shadows, and reflections weren't very viable in games. Amazing technologies, though, like real-time ray tracing, have finally made it possible to have realistic real-time lighting, although it's only really usable on the newest consoles and PC hardware, and even then, it comes at a pretty heavy cost of performance. Instead, techniques like baked lighting were invented. Baked lighting is a practice that takes the highlights and shadows that would be shown on an object and basically adds those details directly onto the texture permanently. Since many objects in the environment are stationary and will only ever have the same shadow, leaving it there permanently to save performance in the game is a technique that has been used for decades. This next example of baked lighting is what actually gave me the idea to make this video. In the original Kingdom Hearts for the PlayStation 2, the player character Sora has dynamic baked lighting, which completely just sounds like regular lighting with extra steps, but let me explain. Let's say when Sora is standing in a fully lit area, his light value is at 100%. And when he's standing completely in a dark, shadowy area, his light value is at 0%. When he's standing right here in the middle, you would expect the shadow to run right down the middle of his model. Instead, his light value is set to around 50%. Covering his entire body with a medium shadow. None of this is happening from the light in the scene. This is all happening by the game changing the dark and light levels of the entirety of the texture itself. It even changes the colors of Sora depending on the color of the light source. This is a super interesting way to reduce the cost of shading on the system and boost performance when compared to using real-time lighting, and it's not something I've seen anywhere else as far as I can remember. Credits to this find goes to Reddit user Mirza Beg, if I pronounced that correctly. That whole generation between the PlayStation 2 and original Xbox are filled to the brim with interesting workarounds and techniques to make games look and run the best that they can using the hardware available. Since we're talking about it, here's another interesting workaround from the Kingdom Hearts series. In Kingdom Hearts 2 for the PlayStation 2, there are several areas in the game that have reflective water or puddles. Being a PlayStation 2 game, real reflections wouldn't work. That's why the developers put entire copies of the environment and its elements mirrored upside down under the map itself. And those spots that look like water, they're just transparent windows. The next thing is a pretty well-known concept, but I think it's worth covering anyway. Parallax is a concept used commonly for backgrounds in 2D games that creates the illusion of depth. It's used in countless games, even in games where you probably thought it was a real 3D environment. This clip is taken from a game called Gris. Or Grease, I don't know. In the background, you can see these trees are the closest, these are a bit farther away, and these are all the way in the back. This is shown by how much each tree moves relative to the character and camera movements. In reality, these layers of trees don't need to be far away, and they very well might not be in the scene. Developers simply give a sort of multiplier to each layer of trees, telling it how much it should shift to the side as the camera moves. For example, this first layer behind where the player is running is probably set to move at 60% of the speed of the main layer. The next 30%, and so on, with the general rule of thumb being that the farther back a layer is, the slower it should move. This all creates the illusion of a 3D environment in a 2D space. This next one is different from the others in a handful of different ways. It's actually a whole technology used in the development of the Star Wars Battlefront reboots. So if you've played these games, the first reboot is already 7 years old at the time of recording this, you'll know that the environments on a graphical level look really good, sometimes photorealistic, and it's extremely impressive for a 2015 game. So instead of modeling and texturing these environments by hand, DICE, the company that mainly developed the game, used a process called photogrammetry. They would send photographers out to real-world places that they wanted to use as a conceptual basis for an environment in the game, and then the photographers would take a bunch of pictures from every angle of certain things like rocks and plants. They'd then take all those pictures, throw them into a software, and that software would essentially create a virtual 3D image of the object. This would help the team tremendously in creating accurate-looking models and textures in a short amount of time for the game. They also used it for clothing and other various things in the games, and I'm sure the limits of the technology have barely even been scratched. There's a full presentation about this topic from GDC, and I'll leave the link for that in the description. Something interesting that fits right into this topic is how building interiors are rendered in Insomniac's Spider-Man game, originally for the PlayStation 4. When you're swinging around the city, you can peer inside windows and see rooms in each one. Typically, they appear to only be plain cube-shaped rooms, but when they appear in nearly every window of many buildings around New York, that would add up to a lot of cubes being rendered all the time, which could affect performance. That's why none of these rooms are actually there at all. Instead of there being actual interior walls rendered, the game creates these spaces using the shader. Shaders are a software component used to handle the lighting in a game. It's not uncommon for a development studio to create their own shader during development in order to manipulate lighting and create situations like this one. According to an article from GameDeveloper.com, the way these rooms are actually made is that the system starts with a texture of the interior, with all 5 visible faces of the room being part of one unfolded texture. And it then shoots an invisible beam from the camera to the window, and depending on the angle and location of the beam, the shader figures out the math of what pixel would be shown on the window if the room was actually there. It seems like a lot, but I guess if it helps performance, it's worth getting creative. The last thing I want to cover is the use of noise. Noise is used in so many games, especially ones that have a lot of randomizing like roguelikes or sandbox games. And when I say noise, I don't mean annoying sounds or the dead static sound on your TV, although the visual of that black and white static isn't too far off. Noise is basically a representation of random data. Let's say you have a program that cranks out a noise map. You'd end up with something like this. You can think of this as working the same way as a topographic map. In this map, red is higher up, and then the closer to blue it is, the lower the altitude. The noise map is representing similar data, but instead of red and blue being the indicators of extreme values, it's represented by black and white, with all the gray being everything in between. So you could think of this black spot as a mountain, and this white spot as a valley. Developers use this for all sorts of things that need to be randomly generated. I'm sure everybody watching has heard of the game Minecraft. This is the sort of thing that they use to make the environment different every time. With different types of noise and a couple adjustments to the math, this could easily be used to create the surface of a Minecraft area, or a system of caves, or where the ore spawns, and so on. If you plan to get into game development at any point, knowing about noise and how flexible of a tool it is will certainly help you out down the line. If you stayed this far into the video, thank you so much for listening. I'm extremely passionate about this sort of stuff, games, how they're made, just what you can do in order to make a digital scene meet your vision. I studied game development in college, and not only do I like the idea that I can share some of what I've learned, I also think little tricks and interesting tidbits like this are good to know for aspiring developers in order to develop the sort of mindset that goes into engineering immersion. I would love to do more of these videos in the future if there's a demand for it, so if you enjoyed the video, definitely like it and let me know in the comments. And also let me know of any cool examples that you know of with the same principles, and I'd love to put them into the next video. Also, to give credit where credit's due, make sure to check out SheSays' Boundary Break series if you find this sort of thing interesting, since there's a lot of overlapping concepts with his videos. And check out GDC's channel if you're interested in learning about game development overall. Thank you so much for watching.
This is a nice beat, Brady.